Dr. Gino Strada is co-founder of Emergency, a humanitarian group that provides free medical care for civilian victims in war zones around the world. He writes about his experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, Somalia, and Sudan in the new book, Green Parrots. Next, he's joined by Howard Zinn, whose latest work is called Just War. At the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Los Angeles, this is an hour, 20 minutes.
It's not easy to pick up the phone, being nobody as nobody I am, and talk to a living legend like Howard Zinn and ask him, would you like to come to LA to give a conference? But there is one quote that is seared in my memory from Howard that gives me courage when I need to pick up the phone and ask him, and that is, there is no flag big enough to cover the shame of taking innocent lives. And whenever I am afraid of talking to him, I remember to myself that quote and pick up the phone. So I said, Howard, we would like to organize a conference similar to what you've done with Gino in Rome in 2005 about just war. And he said, well, if I have the time, I'll be happy. Thank you very much for agreeing to be here tonight. And then, obviously, Gino Strada. Gino Strada, he is on his way to Colorado, where next week he will be receiving a honorary degree from Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And I said, Gino, since you are on your way to Colorado, would you like to come to LA and have a conference with Howard? And so this is how we came to this evening. And again, there is a long story that I cannot recall to you, but the reason why I try my best to serve Emergency USA, which is trying to learn from Emergency, which was founded by Gino, is that Gino is the man who said that either human rights are for everybody or are just privileges, and that gives me courage whenever I remember that quote, to say, Gino, we got to go ahead and do something more. And then I would like to thank the most important ingredient of tonight, which is all of you. Because I think you're going to go home tonight and remember May 12, 2006 as a special night. It's the night that you came out to hear Howard Zinn and Gino Strada. And these two extraordinary people are going to touch your mind, they're going to touch your heart, but it's going to mean nothing if that touching of your mind and touching of your heart is going to translate into action. It will be up to you if we're going to have some extra hands, extra minds, extra hearts, extra leg upon which Emergency USA is going to walk. Thank you very much. Oh, I knew I was forgetting something. A Smith line for the sound system. If the sound system works perfectly, it's the power that has some problems. So thank you, Smith line, as well. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the church. It's such a familiar place now, and it really feels like coming home. And it always feels wonderful to see KPFK listeners in the audience. It's just really wonderful to have this kind of response on such a short notice. I mean, we didn't really have that much time to publicize the event, but perhaps that was good, because I don't know how we could have managed a bigger crowd than this. I'm going to give you a brief rundown of what we're going to be doing today, and then I'll introduce Dr. Gino Strada. We are going to hear first from Dr. Strada. He's going to speak for a few minutes, and he'll be telling us about the clinic. We're here for a fundraise. I mean, I know we're here to see Howard Zinn and Gino Strada, but primarily we're hoping to raise funds this evening for a clinic in Sudan. So we'll be giving you details about that, and you might as well get your wallets and your checkbooks ready. I know it's a little early for the fund drive, but I'll just sort of get warmed up tonight in asking you to donate generously to help open this clinic. So just so you know, that's coming. And then I'll introduce Howard Zinn. He will be speaking for as long as he likes. And who are we to stop Howard Zinn from? Okay, Howard, you have 2 minutes left. Then we'll have a few minutes of questions, but it'll have to be brief because you don't want the event to go on interminably. And Howard has to catch a flight back early in the morning. And then we'll also have a brief time to do a book signing. So that's basically what we have going for the evening. By the way, I want to give a shout out to the Pacifica Radio Archives, which is also in the house. Brian DeShazer is taping Howard Zinn. And the archives has, of course, such an enormous collection of Zinn's words and voices, a voice and so many other voices. So tonight will be added to that archive. Dr. Gino Strada is a man of the world. When you look at what he's done, it's pretty impressive, it's pretty amazing, but it gives you some context for why he does what he does currently, why he's interested in humanitarian work. He graduated in Milan and specialized in surgery, and during the 1980s was mainly involved with heart surgery and heart-lung transplants, spending a lot of time in the United States, particularly at Stanford and Pittsburgh universities. He worked at Harefield Hospital in the UK and Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa. In 1998, he decided to apply his surgical experience to helping and treating victims of war. And from 89 to 94, he worked with the International Red Cross in so many different war zones, from Pakistan to Ethiopia, Thailand, Afghanistan, Peru, Djibouti, Somalia, and Bosnia. And all of this experience that he has accumulated from years of surgery convinced him of the need for a small, agile, and highly specialized organization that's capable of intervening on behalf of civilians and war victims and not hampered by government bureaucracy and the sluggishness of large non-governmental organizations. So with very, very scanty resources, Dr. Gino Strada and a group of friends and colleagues founded the group Emergency in 1994, so 12 years ago. And since then, Emergency has successfully operated and opened hospitals and rehab centers in Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Iraq, very often offering the only support to victims of landmines and other war-related injuries. Dr. Gino Strada spoke alongside Professor Howard Zinn in Rome and has written the introduction to the book Just War that is available for sale today. Some of you have those copies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gino Strada.
Thanks very much, and good evening. I'm going to talk to you about my personal experience of about 20 years in different war zones, and about, more important, the experience of Emergency. Life Support for Civilian War Victims is the name of the organization. Many, many years ago, I was curious to see how my job of being a surgeon would look like in so-called poor countries or third world countries. And what I found was this kind of situation. I mean, these are the hospitals that you will find even today in most of these countries. It would be very difficult to call these hospitals. I mean, they should be called slums or dirty places where patients receive no attention whatsoever, and where in fact are the families in charge of looking after their relatives. Despite this situation, or in addition to that, the level of medical care in these countries is not only poor and very often disgusting, is not free of charge. People must pay to have this kind of care, and if you cannot afford to pay, you are basically condemned to die. So this question, after a while, came to my mind, but who is paying the price of war? Who are the war victims? So I was curious, and I started to collect data from a hospital in Kabul in Afghanistan. And I went through the record of over 12,000 patients to discover this reality that I did not expect, that 34% of the victims were children below 14 years of age, 26% male adults, non-combatants, and then women And only 7%, in fact, of the victims were taking part to the hostilities, were combatants. This was very shocking to me, so I tried to look into the problem and see and find reasons for that. And in fact, I have discovered that a war had evolved over the previous decades, particularly if we compare the situation that was present after World War I. We could see that at the end of that war, only some 15% of the victims were were civilians. The vast majority of the victims were combatants. In other terms, the civilian population were kept sort of at the margin of the hostilities. And this situation that characterized wars until 1915, in fact, reversed with World War II. At the end of World War II, the percentage of civilian casualties was between 60 and 65%, which means the ratio reversed. How was this possible? For sure, several factors contributed to that. The most important were the Holocaust and genocide attempt, as well as the carpet bombing of major European cities during World War II. And finally, the use of the most devastating weapons of mass destruction, like the atomic bomb. At the end of that huge tragedy, which costed the lives of some 50, 60 million people, there were new hopes for a better world, hopes that the world would not have been the same again. And that's when the United Nations started. It's interesting to read today, 60 years later, the United Nations chapter, which gives the rationale for establishing the UN to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. These were new hopes, and there were also new tools like the UN Security Council that was established with the primary goal of ensuring international peace and security. And again, there were new principles, a new philosophy that should have shaped the planet in the coming decades. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed in 1948, was one of these documents, fundamental. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Well, unfortunately, things did not go that way. After World War II, instead of seeing the promotion of human rights, the implementation of human rights, we have witnessed something very different. The world has seen an unprecedented arms race. Arms have been made available to everybody. Here you can see different types of weapons, rockets, machine guns, cluster bombs, these yellow cylinders with a white cotton parachute. And for sure, this arms race contributed to change further the situation. Just to give an idea of the amount of money that has been spent and is presently spent in military, in 2004, the world military expenditures summed to $1,035 billion, which is roughly the amount of money they have available to survive 2 billion people on the planet, the poorest 1/3 of the world population. And instead of promoting human rights and promoting peace and security, the United Nations Security Council, particularly the 5 permanent members, China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, United States, in fact started to produce and export and sell not human rights, but weapons. 85% of the weapons circulating in the world are produced by these countries. So this has been the end result, that in all the conflicts after 1946, the percentage of civilian casualties further increased up to 90% of the total, which means war has evolved dramatically. And if you compare these two slides, you can see that we still use the same term, war, to mean two completely different scenarios. In today's conflicts, it doesn't matter who is officially the enemy, it's the civilian population who's going to pay the price. 9 victims out of 10 are civilians, and 3 victims out of 10 are children. Well, this basically formed the rationale for establishing emergency 12 years ago. An organization with this objective to provide high standard and free of charge medical and surgical care in war-torn zones, and in doing that, hopefully to promote a culture of peace and respect of human rights. We started in 1994 with surgery for war wounded. You can see here some of these wounded, injured by shrapnel from bombs, rockets, injured by high-velocity bullets, injured by anti-personnel mines. I'm going to show you a few slides about anti-personnel mines. They are a bit rough. I apologize for that, but these are different types of landmines that do not look like that in reality. Normally, landmines are not so visible. This is a dry river that I photographed in Iraq back in '95. One of these stones is in fact a landmine. You can see it there. And if you step on one of these mines, you will end up like this. Other mines are even more powerful and will just torn the victim into pieces, as it happens to these children admitted to our hospitals in Kabul. And this again is another type of landmine, also called toy mine. This is what the Afghans call green parrots. The size is about the pack of a cigarette, and the mine goes off only if you pick it up from the ground and manipulate it for a while. Next slide. This is what happens to your hand. Or even more tragic, many children will have one or both hands amputated and will remain blind because of the explosion that affects the chest and the face. We started to look after the wounded in our surgical centers. Here you see some examples. This is the surgical center in Kabul, intensive care unit, and the CT scan we have there. This is one of the hospitals in Iraq, established back in 1998. This is a hospital in Cambodia. This is one of the surgical wards, and this is another emergency hospital in Sierra Leone. And around the hospitals, we established first aid posts and clinics. And of course, being involved with war-injured people means also being involved with rehabilitation, because you must think about the future of these victims. Next. So we try to organize rehabilitation centers where patients can have physiotherapy, can have a prosthetic fitting, and at the end can start the phase of what we call social reintegration, which means teaching the patients a job, trying to have the patients supporting their own families, and organizing vocational training workshops so that the patient can again go back to life with dignity and being useful for the society. At the moment, we have 162 cooperatives in Iraq made by former patients, fully rehabilitated. Next. From treating the war wounded, we moved to treat the victims of war, which is a different concept. children who die from preventable diseases, or women who cannot have a safe pregnancy anymore because war has destroyed all the medical infrastructure. Although they were not hit by bullets or landmines, they are victims of war. And that's why we organize pediatric departments like that one in Afghanistan or this one in Sierra Leone, and maternity hospitals like this in northern Afghanistan. From 1994 to 2005, we have been treating more than 1.8 million victims of war worldwide. As you can see from the graph, the peak happened in the last 3-4 years, and this is due to the fact that besides surgical cases, we started to treat medical cases, and also due to the fact that our largest operations are in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Sudan at the moment. And finally, we tried to move from war-related urgent needs to what we have called sharing human rights, because we are convinced that the right to be cured if you are sick or wounded is a basic human right. And that's how we designed recent projects, particularly the Sudan project. A project that started in Darfur. Darfur is today on the media attention more for political reasons than for humanitarian reasons. Everybody is talking about genocide in Darfur, which is not true. There is a big tragedy, a big humanitarian tragedy, and a civil war that is ongoing since 20 years and has been left for 20 years without any kind of interest or intervention by the international community, and only recently, I suspect more for political reasons than for humanitarian reasons, Darfur has come to the world attention. In Darfur, we have completely refurbished the surgical department in the capital city of northern Darfur, Al-Fashir. And also we started in Sudan another project, which is a pediatric program. This is the clinic we have opened in the internally displaced people camp of Mayo, and the clinic is presently looking after the children that are living in slums around Khartoum. More than 2 million refugees live around Khartoum in terrible conditions, without water, without electricity, without medical care. But we wanted to do something more, and that's why we have added to the Sudan project this third component, which is cardiac surgery. Why cardiac surgery in Sudan? Why this kind of highly specialized medicine in a country where people are still dying because of diarrhea or preventable diseases? Well, the answer is quite simple. If we look at the problem in terms of human rights, we must admit that human rights belong to each and every human being, not only to the rich people. So if we think that we have the right to be cured when we have a cardiac problem, the same right applies to the people living in Sudan or in neighboring countries. That's how we decided to go ahead with this program. The regional center for cardiac surgery that we call Salam, meaning peace in Arabic, is presently under construction in Khartoum, and it will be finished by the end of this year. So within this year, we will start surgical activities. The center will serve not only Sudan, but also the neighboring countries. Here you see some phases of the construction of the center. Yeah. Next. And we hope that this center will help to pass a different message into that area. And the message is that we consider those people equal to us in rights, and dignity as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What did we learn in this 12 years experience in war zones? First, that in contemporary conflicts, 90% of the victims are civilians, 1/3 children. Second, that the humanitarian action must be based on this principle, the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration. In other terms, we cannot accept a humanitarian action that sees medical care as something very technological, sophisticated, effective, if you are talking about our countries. But then, when we think about the poor countries of the world, we tend to believe that sending out a few drugs, a few tablets, and some syringes is more than enough, is not enough. What we have learned in these years is that we must set up hospitals where we would be happy to be treated ourselves, to have our family members and our friends treated there. If these hospitals are good for them, if the hospitals are good for us, means they are also good for those people. And then we have learned that, unfortunately, for most of the war governments, war is always seen as the solution of a problem. But for the war citizens, war is not the solution. War is exactly the problem. It's because of war that the war citizens remain killed or maimed or wounded, and they are poor or hungry, or they are forced to leave their homes and live as refugees. And finally, we have learned that recognizing the basic equality in rights and dignity of all human beings is exactly the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For this, we have come to this conclusion that today there is no more justification for war. There's no more historical justification. There's no more political justification, and there's no more ethical justification. So we've fully realized and fully appreciate the thoughts of Albert Einstein when back in 1932 he stated that war cannot be humanized, that war can only be abolished. And this is exactly the goal that is in front of us. And I'm convinced that if human beings will not be able to push war out of the history, war will push human beings out of the history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gino Strada, for that really, really important foundation that I think all of us need to be reminded of so often. We come now to the time in our program when we ask you to translate your compassion, your enthusiasm, your appreciation for what you've heard tonight and what you're about to hear into dollars, because all of those infrastructures, all of those structures that you saw in the slides don't come cheap. Remember, a hospital that would be good enough to get yourself treated in as somebody from Sierra Leone or Afghanistan or Iraq, that takes money. So I know that you've paid a little money to get in here. We're now going to ask you to dig a little bit deeper, as deep as you can. And there are volunteers standing by with little cardboard boxes that they're going to start passing out now. You can empty your pockets, but even better, pull out your checkbooks and make checks to Emergency USA. That's Emergency USA. They are tax deductible, I understand. Make as big a check as you can. Donate as generously as you can. My own work outside of KPFK is helping to raise funds for humanitarian programs. I know how hard it is to raise funds for these issues. I know also how hard it is to sustain the interest. And while we have your interest, we really want you to do whatever you can. It's sometimes people think, well, what's the point of, I want to work for political change. It's easy to give money, but it's hard to do political change, so I want to be an activist. Well, guess what? It's actually not easy to give money, right? If it was easy, you would give more of it. And so really, I think that's the difficult step. We know that you're all activists, and so we want you to also be a generous humanitarian tonight and donate as much as you can. Again, Emergency USA is the name that you can make the checks out to, or give cash, or give whatever you can. And they are the donations are tax deductible. Give as generously as you can, because truly, these are issues that affect every single one of us. We live here in such privilege, and a relative privilege, I should say. And when we see the images of what's happening in the parts of the world around our country, it's sometimes hard to fathom that those are real human beings with real feelings and limbs that are missing and lives that are being destroyed. So we can do, the littlest bit and spare as much as we possibly can. So please do donate as generously as you can. Now comes my favorite part of the program, to introduce a person who I have been deeply inspired by. I'm an immigrant to the United States, and when I first began educating myself politically, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States was an absolutely crucial part of my education. And I have to say that that book enables me to look a right-wing white male in the eye who tells me that as an immigrant, I'm not fulfilling, the American way, or I'm not living the good patriotic life of an American by speaking out and criticizing this government. And all I have to do is cite Howard Zinn's history and say, no, I am following exactly in the footsteps of the rich legacy of dissent in this country that is part of the history of this country. And I am so proud, because that is the America that I love, the America of the workers and the laborers and the longshoremen and the garment workers. Those are the Americans whose footsteps I do feel that I am hopefully following in, and whose legacy I hope to continue. And that, I wouldn't have had that confidence had it not been for this very powerful and very important book. I want to quote briefly from an essay written by Howard Zinn in 2001, December 2001, which crystallizes for me what an important voice he is. Afghanistan is an issue close to my heart. Some of you may know I do solidarity work with a women's group in Afghanistan. And in December 2001, it was only 2.5 months after the U.S. had begun bombing Afghanistan. And Howard Zinn wrote an essay called A Just Cause, Not a Just War, where he said, I believe two moral arguments can be made about the present so-called war. The September 11th attack constitutes a crime against humanity and cannot be justified, and the bombing of Afghanistan is also a crime which cannot be justified. And yet voices across the political spectrum Many on the left have described this war as a, quote, just war. I have puzzled over this. How can a war be truly just when it involves the daily killing of civilians, when it causes hundreds of thousands of men and women and children to leave their homes to escape the bombs, when it may not find those who planned the September 11th attacks, and when it will multiply the ranks of people who are angry enough at this country to become terrorists themselves? This war amounts to a gross violation of human rights, and it will produce the exact opposite of what is wanted. It will not end terrorism, it will proliferate terrorism. Okay? That was December 2001. We are now in May 2006, and the words that Howard Zinn said back then have come true. We have seen a strengthening of fundamentalist forces in the form of the Northern Alliance, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, you name it, and Afghanistan, once more being forgotten, has in fact become another haven for terrorists, just as it was before 9/11. Meanwhile, of course, the ordinary people are caught between the forces of Western imperialism and Islamic fundamentalism. So I thank Howard Zinn for speaking out at a time when it was really difficult to question the justice of this war, the so-called just war. Howard Zinn is a historian, playwright, social activist. He was a shipyard worker and Air Force bombardier before he went to college under the GI Bill and received his PhD from Columbia University. He's taught at Spelman College and Boston University and been a visiting professor at the University of Paris and the University of Bologna. He's received many awards, including the Thomas Merton Award, the Eugene Debs Award, the Upton Sinclair Award, and the Lannan Literary Award. And he's written, of course, many, many books, including People's History of the United States, and his latest book, Just War, which he will be signing copies of tonight after his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Howard Zinn. And by the way, make checks out to Emergency USA while you're listening to Howard.
Thank you. Thank you, Sonali. Thank you, KPFK. Thank you, Emergency. Emergency has this remarkable bunch of people here in LA who came out of nowhere, just like LA came out of nowhere, I guess. And they're obviously very good organizers. Well, I've known Gino Strada for a few years now. I got to know him when I was asked to write an introduction to his book, Green Parrots, A War Surgeon's Diary, which I urge you all to read. So I did it, and in writing the introduction, of course, I had to read it. Sometimes that happens. And so difficult book to read. Well, obviously, and you know, and Gino has shown you here the kind of work he's done, and you can only imagine what in 10 to 15 years of working on war victims, what that means, what that's like. But what interested me was when I came to the end of his book. At the end of his book, he says, in effect, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to operate on children anymore. I don't want to amputate the arms of kids who have been devastated by landmines anymore. You know, we need to abolish war. And then he invited me to Rome, which is, of course, a difficult invitation to accept. But I went. And then you might say he enlisted me in the idea of starting to spread the word in this country and everywhere, the word that we cannot accept war anymore as a solution for any of the problems that we have in the world. I mean, we are now struggling, we in this country, to stop the war in Iraq. We're working very hard on that. And we're going to succeed. The the war in Iraq is going to have to come to an end. But what happens then? What happens after the war in Iraq? Our country has been fighting war after war after war ever since the end of World War II, ever since that war which was supposed to bring an end to war. And after Vietnam, we thought, no more wars. And then the government decided also, oh, well, the people of the United States apparently have turned against war. This is bad. They described what they called the Vietnam syndrome. Syndrome is a word for sickness. The sickness was that the American people had turned against the government, against the FBI, against Congress, against the establishment, against the war. This was the Vietnam syndrome, and the United States government set out to somehow do away with that syndrome by fighting small, quick, victorious wars against weak opponents to get the American population accustomed to war, once again. This is what they've been trying to do. The Iraq War represents the latest of it, except that it hasn't been quick. It's been going on for 3 years. And it may be that the Vietnam syndrome has not been eliminated, that the American people are beginning to understand the futility of war, the immorality of war. We're seeing a growth in consciousness among the American people, and that's a very positive, encouraging thing to see. But what comes next? They're already beating the drums for war in Iran, right? Already talking about bombing Iran, already drawing up the plans. And when they're confronted with this, they said, we're only drawing up plans. They're creating a hysteria about Iran the way they created a hysteria about Iraq. I don't think they will succeed this time. I think the American people have learned something about the war in Iraq, which makes them more suspicious of what the government is saying about Iran. But I think we have to think about not this war, not the next war. We don't want to have to create another anti-war movement and another anti-war movement and another anti-war movement. We really have to present in the world the idea, an idea which is sort of obviously utopian and long-term, but an idea which absolutely must take hold. Its time has come, and the idea that war must be abolished. And Gino Strada showed you, told you about Einstein's quote. When Einstein said that in 1932, he was attending a conference in Geneva, which was called a disarmament conference. Anytime you see the words disarmament conference, be suspicious. When the governments of the world use the word disarmament, they don't mean it. And so Einstein attended this disarmament conference. He, like so many people, was disillusioned by the horror of World War I. And what did he hear at this disarmament conference? He heard these nations talking about, well, these weapons will be banned, and these weapons will be okay. And he did something which nobody expected Einstein to do. He called a press conference. Einstein doesn't do things like that. But he did, and he said, and you saw those words on the screen, war cannot be humanized, war can only be abolished. And that's the theme of this campaign that we want to initiate. And you're part of the initiation. We expect you to spread the word. You expect you to not just to stop the war in Iraq, but we expect you to begin talking to everybody you can about the abolition of war itself. Governments are not going to do it. Governments can never be depended to advance the cause of peace or justice or human rights. I mean, in the course of human history, governments have never been dependable in taking care of the needs of people. And after all, governments are not set up for that purpose. Governments are set up to serve certain interests, and those are not the interests of the people. This is a very important thing for people to grasp. People who have some naive conception that we very often grow up with in this country, that the government is our friend, and no, the government is not our friend. Occasionally, it can get friendly. When there's a great people's movement that compels it to be friendly, and then, so it is really up to us. It is up to the people of the world to abolish war, because governments won't do it. Very often you hear it's said that, well, people are not going to do it because war is part of human nature. How many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard, I think I once figured it out, anytime you get into a discussion of war, like 12 minutes into the conversation, somebody says, oh, it's human nature. Test that out. It's a scientific observation of mine. 12 minutes, yeah. If war were a part of human nature, governments would not have to go to such enormous lengths to persuade people to go to war. People would rush spontaneously. No, governments have to work at it. They have to work very hard at it. The natural instincts of people are not for war. The natural instincts of people are for compassion and comradeship and brotherhood and sisterhood. Those are the natural instincts of people, but governments work very hard. They work by seduction, they work by propaganda, and they work by coercion to get people to go to war. No, at the end of World War II, when the Nazi leaders were being tried in Nuremberg, and they were in their prison cells awaiting trial, and a psychologist was given the job of interviewing these Nazi leaders in their prison cells, talking to them. And one of them wrote a book. He kept a diary, he kept notes, and he records in his book a conversation he had with Hermann Goering, second in command to Hitler, head of the Luftwaffe, and he asked, well, how come the German people went along with Hitler? And Goering said, well, of course, people don't want war. Some poor Slav, this was Goering's word, I don't know what the word is in German, but this is how they interpreted it, translated it. Some poor Slav working on a farm, he doesn't want to go to war, but he can be convinced, he can be propagandized, he can be told there's an enemy out there that must be defeated, he can be told that this is done for the country, this is done for the people, and then you can mobilize a population for war. And this is true, Goering said, in any country. That last part of it was interesting to me. It's not just totalitarian governments, it's not just tyrannical governments that propagandize their people for war, it's so-called democratic liberal governments. And of course that has happened in this country again and again and again, where people have been deceived, people have been lied to, and we're now aware of all the lies and deceptions that have been told in connection with this war in Iraq. But the history of government lies and deception in order to get the people of the country to go to war, that goes way back. I mean, how else can governments get people to go to war? It goes back to the Mexican War. It goes back to the war in Cuba. It goes back to the Philippines. It goes back through all the wars that we've fought, deception, lies, and that's how they do it. So our job is to reach back to the essential feelings of people and to break through these fogs of propaganda and cries for war, these false slogans that are raised that talk about we're going to war for democracy, we're going to war for freedom. We now have a history which shows that all these so-called wars for freedom and democracy have not brought freedom and democracy to any of the people that we've waged war against. And they certainly haven't brought freedom and democracy to this country. And you will hear them say, Memorial Day is coming up, come to think of it. Memorial Day is coming up at the end of this month, and you'll have a lot of flag waving and a lot of trumpets blowing and a lot of speeches made honoring the dead of wars. And of course, yes, the people who died in wars should be honored, but war should not be honored. And the makers of war should not be honored, you see. And you will hear the speech makers say they gave their lives for their country. How many times have you heard that? They gave their lives for their country. There's a double lie in that. One, they did not give their lives were taken away from them, you see. You know. And second, they didn't die for their country, they died for their government. The country did not profit from their deaths. There were interests that profited from their deaths. In the present case, the young people who are dying in Iraq, thank you. The young people who are dying in Iraq, that's Marco, who's keeping me alive. Regular doses of water and who knows what else, you see. But the young people who are dying in Iraq are not dying for the country. It's a terrible thing to say the country is not benefiting from their deaths. They're dying for Bush and Cheney. They're dying for Halliburton and the corporations that make money out of war. Wise men throughout history have recognized this. Plutarch recognized this. The poor go to war for the benefit of the rich. Eugene Debs recognized this. He was sent to prison for 10 years in World War I for saying it's the poor, the working class, who fight the wars, and it's the rich who send them to war. I went through a certain trajectory myself about war, because there was a time when I believed in the concept of just war. That is, I believed that there were just wars and unjust wars. Good wars and bad wars, and I think that's a very, very common belief among people, you know. Although I once had a student who wrote a paper about war, and in her paper she said, you know, wars are like wines. There are good years and bad years. There are good wars and bad wars. But she said, war is not like wine. War is like cyanide. One drop and you're dead. I always remembered what she said, because it fitted my own experience, the development of my own thought. Because I volunteered for the Second World War. I had to tell you what war it was so that you wouldn't think it was the Spanish-American War. But I volunteered for for that war and became a bombardier in the Air Force, and because I believe this was a good, yes, it was right. It was a good war. Studs Terkel has done a world history of people who lived through World War II, and he calls it the good war. Although if you look closely, you'll see he put quotation marks around good war, because as he talked to people more and more, he found more and more questions from people who had participated in the war about the war. What happened to me is I entered the war as an enthusiastic bombardier. And what could be more just? It was a war against fascism. What could be more evil in the world? I mean, they're trying to portray all these two-bit dictators in the world as Hitlers. No, Noriega of Panama, Saddam Hussein. No, Hitler was evil incarnate, yes, and fascism was evil. And so, yes, I believed in this war, and so I went ahead and I dropped bombs on various cities in Europe, in Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and even France. It wasn't until the war ended that I began to think about what I had been doing. I read John Hersey's account of his interviews with the survivors of Hiroshima. Remember, he was the journalist who went into Hiroshima after the bombing and talked to the survivors. You can imagine what these survivors looked like. People without arms, people without legs, blind, people whose skin you couldn't bear to look at. And he recorded what they told him. And I read that, and I realized that I did not know when I dropped my bombs what I was doing to human beings. You drop bombs from 30,000 feet high, 6 miles high, you don't see any people. You don't hear screams, you don't see blood. You don't know what you're doing. I mean, this is so much the nature of modern warfare. You know, people blithely send off rockets and cruise missiles and drop bombs, and they really don't know what they are doing. And they come back and you see them on television exultant. We just completed our mission. I remember those pictures at the end of during the first Gulf War. The pilots would come back for their missions. We hit our targets. The truth is they did not know what they hit. You know? And so I began to think about that, and began to think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and think about those several 100,000 people who died. These were not the people who bombed Pearl Harbor. These were the children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I began to think about the 100,000 people in Tokyo who died in one night of firebombing in Tokyo in the spring of 1945. Yeah. One night of firebombing. And we had denounced the fascists for bombing civilian populations. We had denounced them for their cruelty, their brutality, and here we were. And the bombing of Dresden, and the bombing of, 30,000, 40,000, 60,000 people, Frankfurt, Hamburg, altogether perhaps 600,000 civilians in Germany died in the bombing. An equal number died, 600,000 or so, in Japan. I began to think about the good war and the just war, and realized that war poisons everybody who engages in it. You start off, I recreated my own psychology, that is, starting off deciding these are the bad guys, we are the good guys. And then realizing that once I had made that initial decision that they are the bad guys and we are the good guys, once I made that initial decision, I didn't have to think anymore. I didn't have to question anything anymore. From that point on, anything goes. That's just the psychology of the just war, And so then Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then Tokyo, then anything can happen. And what I didn't realize was that what war does is it turns everybody into bad guys, both sides, whatever the initiating situation was. And you can look back through history, and you see this happening again. You go back to the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians were the good guys, and the Spartans were the bad guys. And then, in the course of the war, the Athenians began to behave just like the Spartans. So yeah, I began to think about. Here I was testing war by its best example, World War II. This example that everybody points to, and they say, well, you know, there's such a thing as a good war, and World War II is an example. So I wanted the most extreme test of the idea of a good war, which is World War II. And when I looked at it, I came away with a much more complex view of this good war than I had at the beginning. And I realized that what happens in war, even a war against a tyrant, and war is always against a tyrant. There's always a tyrant to make war on. When you make war against a tyrant, the people you kill are the victims of the tyrant. This is what we've been doing all along. People we've been killing in Iraq and saying, oh, you know, Saddam Hussein, we've got to get rid of Saddam Hussein. People we kill in Iraq are the victims of Saddam Hussein. So yeah, and then I looked at the world after the war, as the years went by, and I had at the end of the war I had gotten a letter from General Marshall, who was the general of generals in World War II, and I think it was the first 5-star general. It was, you might say, a personal letter addressed to me and 16 million others who had served in the military. And the letter says something like, congratulations, we've won the war against the terrible foe, and it will be a new world. Well, looking around, and you saw in Gino's chart about the wars that have followed World War II. Looking around the world after the war, we had defeated fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, the Japanese military machine. We had not defeated fascism around the world. There was still fascism in the world. There's still racism in the world. There's still militarism in the world, and there's still war. War after war after war. So I came to the conclusion that war is a quick fix. As violence is always a quick fix. When you can't really solve a problem intelligently, you turn to violence. You know, and violence seems to solve something. Well, it's like a drug, and war is a drug. You know, you win and you have a high. Don't ask me how I know this, but you win the war, there's a moment of exultation. I remember when the war ended in Europe, and I was there in England, and the lights went on all over England, and we poured into the streets for the first time with the lights on in the city of Norwich, England, and they were passing out fish and chips to everybody free. It was great, all that exultation. And then the reality sets in. And the reality after World War II was 50 million people had died, and we were still going through war after war. And so, yes, we have to decide once and for all, no matter how long it takes. And after all, the movement against slavery was a utopian movement in the 1830s. I mean, how are you going to abolish slavery? They're holding 4 million black people in slavery, and it's very useful to them. We're not going to be able to do this. But a movement grew. Slavery was not abolished just by the Emancipation Proclamation. A movement, an anti-slavery movement grew. It seemed utopian at the beginning, but it grew and grew and grew, and finally reached a point where Lincoln and Congress had to react to it, and slavery was abolished. It's possible. It's possible to end war. It's, you know, you can go through an experience, and bad experience, bad experience, bad experience, and you begin to think, we can't stop this. We can only have bad experiences, and then a certain point is reached where something snaps and you say, I'm not going to do this anymore. We have to do that with war. And it's, and we have to think about this. They cannot carry out wars without us. This is a very important thing. It's just like the workers in General Motors in the 1930s when they faced the enormously powerful corporation, General Motors, and they were working under conditions which they didn't like, for wages which were too low and hours which were too long. He said, we're not going to be able to defeat General Motors, you see. And then they realized General Motors needs us. All we have to do is stop working, and General Motors is helpless. That's true of governance. When people decide that they are not going to support the government, when GIs decide that they are not going to continue fighting, when they come back from the war and they organize against the war, when the government simply cannot find enough people to carry on the war, then the war must come to an end. This is what happened in the Vietnam War. What happened in the Vietnam War is, and many of you remember this, that more and more and more people in the United States turned away from the government, and the government did not have legitimacy anymore. And it could not carry on the war when ROTC chapters closed, and when hundreds of thousands of young people refused to go to war, and when the GIs came back, and the GIs in the field were refusing to go out on patrol, and B-52 pilots were refusing to fly B-52s over Hanoi and Haiphong anymore. And then, and the Vietnam veterans came back and they formed Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and they threw their medals over a fence in Washington, D.C., and at a certain point the government decided, no, it will not be able to carry on the war. This is beginning to happen in the war in Iraq. And so the war at some point will come to an end. And it is up to us to decide that we are not going to support any war, whatever reason is given to us by whatever liars sit in the White House. We're not going to do that. Because for if nothing else, aside from the horrors of war, for one very important reason, war and the expenditure of all of our energy and talent and national wealth for war is preventing us from solving the problems that we have in the world, the really serious problems that we have in the world, the sickness and homelessness and the lack of water in the world, and what's happening to the environment, and how do we deal with natural disasters like Katrina and what happened in Asia when the earthquakes come. These are things that are affecting huge, huge numbers of people, billions of people, and we're not able to deal with that because the governments are fixed on war. So that's one very, very important reason for abolishing war, because it is possible to imagine a world without war. It's possible to imagine a world in which this very talented human race, we are very talented, you know how talented, amazing things are done by human beings. We turn our talents to creating a world where everybody has health care and everybody is housed and the air is cleaned up and the waters are cleaned up. It's possible to do that, you see. And so we will start modestly here in this church. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are nearly at the end of our evening. We are going to spend a few minutes on question and answers, and then there will be a book signing. I believe books will be sold over there and signed over here. Surprisingly, we have a large stack of questions before the speech was even over. How do you know what to ask him if he hadn't even finished yet? Anyway, here's a big stack of questions. We're not going to get through all of them, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have professors pick them like as if you were picking cards from a deck. And we're just going to have to do it that way because we're not going to get through them. Just pick one.
Ooh,
pick one.
It's the card trick,
Yeah,
okay.
I'll read it out. All right. How do you motivate a community in this egotistical society to care about one another when the community is at war with itself? I am the future, my community is the future, and our voice is oppressed. I'm assuming this is coming from a young person.
It's interesting. People who ask questions always think that the people up here have the answers. And generally, people really answer their own questions. The person who asked this question is obviously motivated. And most people are. And most people want to do good things. So all you have to do is give them an opportunity, create a space for them, encourage them, start out, do it first yourself. But I believe that it's not hard to motivate people to do the right thing. Things happen by example. And the person who asked this question is an example. And so it will spread, I'm sure.
There must...
No.
Okay. No, trust me, you don't want me to pick. I don't want to be accused of selectively picking these. All right, we often hear that democracies don't war with each other, which seems to be mostly true. What do you think about that?
Should we take comfort in that? That they only war on other people? That they've managed to, because so-called democracies are countries which are advanced industrial countries that mostly get along with one another, and so they vent their wrath and their anger on most of the world. And so the fact that they may not be at war with one another should not encourage us. I recall that Henry Kissinger, if you pardon me for mentioning his name, I recall that Henry Kissinger he wrote in his doctoral dissertation, that the period between the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and World War I was 100 years of peace. Well, yes, it was peace among the nations of Europe. It was not peace between the nations of Europe and the peoples of Africa and Asia. It was a period of imperialism, of brutal colonialism. And so, let's think beyond the so-called democracies to the need for peace with all parts of the world. Yeah.
Okay, I'm actually going to read out a question directed at Dr. Gino Strada, which is, in your view, is emergency an anti-war force?
Well, I would say that our anti-war feelings did not originate from, a political or ideological choice. They basically originated on the operating tables. How can you be a doctor? How can you look after war wounded and at the same time be in favor of this carnage to continue? So I think it was a human reaction to what we have seen, and And that's probably the basic point. On top of it, I must say that we all felt very disgusted by the fact that regardless the reason for fighting a war, the end result that we have seen was always the same. We have seen normal people, poor people, ending up killed, wounded, maimed. Most of them, they did not even know what was going on around them. I mean, can you imagine an Afghan citizen? They don't know why there is so much violence around them, why foreign militaries are occupying their countries all the time. The Russians before, now the Americans and the British and the Canadians and the Italians. I mean, it would be very strange to accept this also for us. We tend to believe that there are countries where people like to be colonized. It's not true. Basically, what emergency is trying to do is building human rights in the medical field, because we believe that the only prevention or the only preventive medicine towards war is the construction of human rights, and that's what we are trying to do, basically.
Does Emergency have a website?
Sorry?
Does Emergency have a website that you can share?
Yeah, we have the website, which is www.emergencyusa.org, or also the website, the Italian website, because Emergency was originally established in Italy, which is www.emergency.it.
All right.
I hope I'm picking one for
I can read.
Yeah. You want to read it?
Yeah. Okay, First time in history, no bid corporations. If corporations continue to create the need for war and resources, how do we stop this and how do we get these people out? First time in history, no bid corporations. Do you want to answer that?
I'll answer it the way it was asked. But when you don't really want to answer a question, you just answer another question that you made up yourself. But I will answer this. So, here's something I've been meaning to say, and so this gives me a chance. The question period gives you a chance to say things that you forgot to say. War is a business, right? Corporations make a lot of money from war. There are all these huge multi-billion contracts, very often no-bid contracts given out to friends of the politicos. I remember during the Vietnam War, there was an artist in the anti-war movement who did a poster, very simple poster with these words, powerful words, but also chilling. War is good for business. Invest your son.
Okay, here's another question for Dr. Gino Strada. Why did Emergency open its medical services in northern Sudan rather than the south?
Well, there's no answer in the sense that if you look at the world map, I think there's need to open medical facilities basically in every country on the planet. If by medical facilities we mean something where medicine is given free of charge to human beings as it should be. So in this respect, I think there's no Northern Sudan or Southern Sudan. I am convinced, for instance, that the policy of having healthcare as a business is a crime against the society. Having said that, there is no particular reason. You know, many times you open up operations because you go to a place and you happen to have contacts with certain people before you have contacts with other people, and basically everywhere you turn you see huge needs, and unfortunately we are able to respond only this much. So instead of spending, you know, years and maybe organizing seminars and congresses to decide is it better to operate here or there, you better fold your sleeves and start doing something.
Last question, I've been told. Sorry to all of those folks. Okay, this is a question for Professor Zinn. You offer hope that a new war on Iran can be prevented, but Bush can launch a war without popular support. He now threatens use of nuclear weapons. This will have catastrophic results. What do you think can be done to prevent this?
Stalling for time. In the movement against the war, we have an obligation to do a lot of education about the situation in Iran. You know, one sort of simple fact, you know, against this hysteria, a fact which is always buried about sort of 12 paragraphs down and 20 pages into the major newspapers, is that all of the nuclear all the experts on nuclear technology tell us that Iran is 5 to 10 years away from developing one nuclear weapon. 5 to 10 years. And people have to be confronted with this very simple juxtaposition that Iran is 5 to 10 years away from possibly developing one nuclear weapon. The United States has 10,000 nuclear weapons. Israel has several hundred nuclear weapons. The idea that this possibility of a future weapon in Iran is an imminent threat and therefore deserves violent reaction is absurd and dangerous and stupid.
I want to thank Professor Howard Zinn, Dr. Gino Strada, and all of you so much for coming this evening.
The event was a benefit for Emergency, an international medical aid outfit co-founded by Gino Strada. For more information, visit emergencyusa.org. Dr. Gino Strada is co-founder of Emergency, a humanitarian group that provides free medical care for civilian victims in war zones around the world. He writes about his experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, Somalia, and Sudan in the new book, Green Parrots. Next, he's joined by Howard Zinn, whose latest work is called Just War. At the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Los Angeles, this is an hour, 20 minutes.
It's not easy to pick up the phone, being nobody as nobody I am, and talk to a living legend like Howard Zinn and ask him, would you like to come to LA to give a conference? But there is one quote that is seared in my memory from Howard that gives me courage when I need to pick up the phone and ask him, and that is, there is no flag big enough to cover the shame of taking innocent lives. And whenever I am afraid of talking to him, I remember to myself that quote and pick up the phone. So I said, Howard, we would like to organize a conference similar to what you've done with Gino in Rome in 2005 about just war. And he said, well, if I have the time, I'll be happy. Thank you very much for agreeing to be here tonight. And then I ever see Gino Strada. Gino Strada, he is on his way to Colorado, where next week he will be receiving a honorary degree from Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And I said, Gino, since you are on your way to Colorado, would you like to come to LA and have a conference with Howard? And so this is how we came to this evening. And again, there is a long story that I cannot recall to you, but the reason why I try my best to serve Emergency USA, which is trying to learn from Emergency, which was founded by Gino, is that Gino is the man who said that either human rights are for everybody or are just privileges, and that gives me courage whenever I read.
The level of medical care in these countries is not only poor and very often disgusting, is not free of charge. People must pay to have this kind of care. And if you cannot afford to pay, you are basically condemned to die. So this question, after a while, came to my mind, but who is paying the price of war? Who are the war victims? So I was curious, and I started to collect data from a hospital in Kabul in Afghanistan. And I went through the record of over 12,000 patients to discover this reality that I did not expect, that 34% of the victims were children below 14 years of age, 26% male adults, non-combatants, and then women, and only 7%, in fact, of the victims were taking part to the hostilities, were combatants. This was very shocking to me, so I tried to look into the problem and see and find reasons for that. And in fact, I have discovered that a war had evolved over the previous decades, particularly if we compare the situation that was present after World War I, we could see that at the end of that war, only some 15% of the victims were were civilians. The vast majority of the victims were combatants. In other terms, the civilian population were kept sort of at the margin of the hostilities. And this situation that characterized wars until 1915, in fact, reversed with World War II. At the end of World War II, the percentage of civilian casualties was...
Remember that quote, to say, Gino, we got to go ahead and do something more. And then I would like to thank the most important ingredient of tonight, which is all of you. Because I think you're going to go home tonight and remember May 12, 2006 as a special night. It's the night that you came out to hear Howard Zinn and Gino Strada. And these two extraordinary people are going to touch your mind, they're going to touch your heart, but it's going to mean nothing if that touching of your mind and touching of your heart is going to translate into action. It will be up to you if we're going to have some extra hands, extra minds, extra hearts, extra leg upon which Emergency USA is going to walk. Thank you very much. Oh, I knew I was forgetting something. A Smith line for the sound system. If the sound system works perfectly, it's the power that has some problems. So thank you, Smith line, as well. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the church. It's such a familiar place now, and it really feels like coming home. And it always feels wonderful to see KPFK listeners in the audience. It's just really wonderful to have this kind of response on such a short notice. I mean, we didn't really have that much time to publicize the event, but perhaps that was good, because I don't know how we could have managed a bigger crowd than this. I'm going to give you a brief rundown of what we're going to be doing today, and then I'll introduce Dr. Gino Strada. We are going to hear first from Dr. Strada. He's going to speak for a few minutes, and he'll be telling us about the clinic. We're here for a fundraiser. I mean, I know we're here to see Howard Zinn and Gino Strada, but primarily we're hoping to raise funds this evening for a clinic in Sudan. So we'll be giving you details about that, and you might as well get your wallets and your checkbooks ready. I know it's a little early for the fund drive, but I'll just sort of get warmed up tonight in asking you to donate generously to help open this clinic. So just so you know, that's coming. And then I'll introduce Howard Zinn. He will be speaking for as long as he likes. And who are we to stop Howard Zinn from? Okay, Howard, you have 2 minutes left. And then we'll have a few minutes of questions, but it'll have to be brief, because you don't want the event to go on interminably. And Howard has to catch a flight back early in the morning. And then we'll also have a brief time to do a book signing. So that's basically what we have going for the evening. By the way, I want to give a shout out to the Pacifica Radio Archives, which is also in the house. Brian DeShazer is taping Howard Zinn. And the archives has, of course, such an enormous collection of Zinn's words and voices, a voice and so many other voices. So tonight will be added to that archive. Dr. Gino Strada is a man of the world. When you look at what he's done, it's pretty impressive, it's pretty amazing, but it gives you some context for why he does what he does currently, why he's interested in humanitarian work. He graduated in Milan and specialized in surgery, and during the 1980s was mainly involved with heart surgery and heart-lung transplants, spending a lot of time in the United States, particularly at Stanford and Pittsburgh universities. He worked at Harefield Hospital in the UK and Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa. In 1998, he decided to apply his surgical experience to helping and treating victims of war. And from 89 to 94, he worked with the International Red Cross in so many different war zones, from Pakistan to Ethiopia, Thailand, Afghanistan, Peru, Djibouti, Somalia, and Bosnia. And all of this experience that he has accumulated from years of surgery convinced him of the need for a small, agile, and highly specialized organization that's capable of intervening on behalf of civilians and war victims and not hampered by government bureaucracy and the sluggishness of large non-governmental organizations. So with very, very scanty resources, Dr. Gino Strada and a group of friends and colleagues founded the group Emergency in 1994, so 12 years ago. And since then, Emergency has successfully operated and opened hospitals and rehab centers in Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Iraq, very often offering the only support to victims of landmines and other war-related injuries. Dr. Gino Strada spoke alongside Professor Howard Zinn in Rome and has written the introduction to the book Just War that is available for sale today. Some of you have those copies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gino Strada.
Thanks very much, and good evening. I'm going to talk to you about my personal experience of about 20 years in different war zones, and about, more important, the experience of Emergency. Life Support for Civilian War Victims is the name of the organization. Many, many years ago, I was curious to see how my job of being a surgeon would look like in so-called poor countries or third world countries. And what I found was this kind of situation. I mean, these are the hospitals that you will find even today in most of these countries. It would be very difficult to call these hospitals. I mean, they should be called slums or dirty places where patients receive no attention whatsoever, and where in fact are the families in charge of looking after their relatives. Despite this situation, or in addition to that,